I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. By now we were in high school. One day we decided we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country. We were exploring and trying to find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers and even discovered bridges no one went to. We fished, we hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went on our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits, so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our old trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix, so soon we decided to take a day to walk the trails and camp one night and then walk home. The day finally came and we started out early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought this was an absolutely crazy idea and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. I mean, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun, and a little sad even, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to settle in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had bought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill or something and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a small, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place and was also weathered black. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and we went back up the hill to our spot we had picked for camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to be the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. You hear that? What the hell is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but maybe in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was getting ready to say, "Let's just get the heck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out very well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran to the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back, and we saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and we came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. I'm a huge fan of cities, and this is likely a result of me having been raised in rural Kentucky. Something which always endeared me to them is the fantastic structures and the wonderful culture which developed subsequently from such a large population of people. I have two uncles which at one time both lived in New York City, which afforded me of several opportunities to visit them in the city very often. I am a decently introverted person, and I have been with the same girl for all of high school. When our senior spring break 2018 approached, we were able to negotiate a trip to New York City with her parents. On the drive to the airport, we had found out that her brother, whose flight departure preceded ours by several days, had tried a drug called DMT in the city and was in the hospital. This tremendously altered the way in which the trip unfolded and gave my girlfriend and me free time while her parents went to the hospital. A bad cocktail and ignorance and arrogance corrupted me a little bit on this trip, having visited the city several times with no hiccups, so I made some bad decisions in retrospect. Among these was staying out very late, just the pair of us, several nights in a row. One night, after a long day, we both got on the subway at about midnight to ride to our hotel from downtown. My girlfriend decided to sit on the subway next to an approximately 40-year-old man who wore a dilapidated black hoodie and a drawstring bag. He started to make conversation with her, and because I got nervous, I sat between them under false pretenses of being tired. The air around this guy was stale, and he hushed up for a moment, only to proceed to make conversation with me. My girlfriend had apparently indicated to him via a mild country accent that we were visiting, and he started with, "Where are you from?" I have a much more tamed accent and demeanor, and I calmly made conversation with the otherwise intimidating guy. Next thing I know, the conversation turned very quickly as he started to threaten me. "How about you give me whatever money you have in that thick wallet of yours?" He said it with a loud stomp as he puffed his chest out. I tried to divorce myself from fear and diagnosed it as an attempt at humor, so I laughed. My girlfriend did not, as she tenaciously grabbed my hand. "Your girlfriend looks like she is holding on to you for dear life. How about I help you guys find your way home?" I declined his offer and informed him that we are going to Midtown and we will be getting off close to our hotel. "That's where I'm going too," he muttered. Things were tense and my heart was racing. He even continued to make aggressive comments and gestures until we got off the train. Crisis averted, we had thought until we started walking and noticed that we had gotten off at the wrong station. In fact, about 6 too soon. So we turned around to catch the train again, and there he was, walking towards us, off of the train. He inquired as to what changed and what we were getting back on for. After making more comments about my girlfriend's now obvious terror, and I informed him that I misread the directions on my phone. We got back on the train and saw him weigh in his options as he considered to follow us back on, but the door was already shut and we were well on our way. Only when I got back to the hotel did I realize that this man was staggering his exit, by his own admission, at the wrong stop to follow us, and which makes me fear what he would have done had we not mistakenly exited and rebounded. We never stayed out that late again for the rest of the trip. I consider myself a fairly religious person, and back in April of 2016, I had been attending my church for about a year. My church is one of the largest in my city and has a partnership with an equally large church across town. As a result, both congregations do several events together throughout the year. It was through one of these events that I met Dee, someone who started out a good friend but ended up turning into the first and only stalker I hope to have dealt with by the end of my life. On Good Friday evening, 2016, my church was having a combined worship service with the church across town, and I decided to attend. Before I found my church, I had been looking at joining our partner church, but I never got to go out and visit, and I was excited to see what the atmosphere was like. When I got there, tons of people were filing in and trying to find a seat, and as I scanned the aisle to try and find someone I know to sit with, a loud whisper caught my attention. A young man about my age was motioning for me to come sit next to him in the pew he was sitting in, and not wanting to stand up against the wall all evening, I accepted his offer. Once we sat next to each other, he introduced himself as D and welcomed me to the church. We spent service getting to know each other, cracking Bible jokes, cheesy I know, and hooting and hollering with the rest of the crowd whenever the pastor said something that stirred a rise out of everyone in attendance. He was funny, charismatic, goofy, and just the type of person that I liked hanging out with. So at the end of the evening, we gave each other our phone numbers and agreed to meet up and hang out as friends when we both had free time. One thing that's important to know about me is that I kind of have a sixth sense when it comes to figuring out people. And if there's any kind of indication that someone is off or bad news, I usually get a gut feeling immediately. However, I also have a degree of naivety and very trusting personality that often causes me to ignore these gut feelings more than I'd like to admit. And I end up getting myself into troublesome situations that wouldn't have happened if I had just listened to my instincts from the get-go. I got that feeling with D in the beginning, but almost immediately, he came out and told me that he suffered from Asperger's. So I chalked whatever intuition I had about him to me picking up on that. But little did I know how wrong I was. Something that I would only begin to find out as early as a week later. One day, when school resumed from spring break, I was sitting in the lobby of the building where the majority of my classes were that semester, doing homework when D called me out of the blue. I picked up right away, excited to talk to my new friend. We made general chit-chat and he asked if we could get together, which I declined because school was getting busy as summer break approached. He understood and we went back to talking about other things when he suddenly veered the conversation to something very dark and creepy. "When I saw you at church the other night, there was something I wanted to tell you, something that God wanted me to tell you, but you weren't ready to hear it yet. I knew who you were before you even said a word to me because God gave me a vision about you. He's been giving me them since 2013, when he showed me the whole plan for my life. He has a plan for the two of us, but that won't be revealed until later on, and only if we decide to go further. I'm going to hang up now and let you process that." With that, D hung up the phone and I sat in the lobby, confusedly staring into space and wondering what the hell I just heard. After a few minutes of pondering, I chalked it up to being one of those things that people with Asperger's sometimes might fixate on, and pushed it to the back of my mind. I didn't hear anything from Dee for a few weeks after that. School ended and summer came, and Dee and I finally made plans to hang out. We did everything that normal friends did, hiking in the metro parks, going to Dairy Queen, and I was even invited to his birthday party and met some of his friends from when he went to high school. When we were alone, Dee would tell me about his visions, something that started to make me feel more and more uneasy. The reason why I will explain in a moment. It was around this time that I also started getting really depressed. It had been a hard school year for me, and the summer before, I had gotten out of a situation that had been extremely traumatic. For 2 years, I had been in a church that taught things very similar to the things Dee talked about, and hearing him talk about those things caused me to have flashbacks. If you've ever seen the part in Borat where he's in the Pentecostal church in the South, that was what I had been caught up in. Now that school was over and I had ample free time to think, what had happened to me started to hound me and catch up to me more and more. But while the things Dee talked about also brought back a lot of that trauma, I considered him a friend and I wanted to help him realize that what he believed in was very dangerous. And that is why things went on as long as they did. Aside from this part of things, however, Dee was still a good friend to me at this point. He listened whenever I talked to him about my depression, and I even realized that he had his own mental health struggles in the past, and had even lost a good friend to it a few years back. So it felt nice to have someone to listen to me. School started up again, and I started inviting Dee to come to midweek services at my church. We had and still have a ministry geared toward college students, due to the church being right next door to the university I was going to when all of this happened. I was battling my own demons, but I wanted to see Dee so badly that his beliefs were harmful that I was willing to let myself be overtaken by them if it meant helping someone else. Things continued to get worse as I got more and more depressed. Dee continued to talk almost incessantly by this point about his visions, even going as far as to say that he was a prophet and he had special powers. Yet while I was scared, I was also too depressed to really do anything about it. This was how things were until fall of 2017, when the real stuff this story is about started. I don't know at what point I realized, but things with Dee were going in a direction I didn't want them to. The more time I spent with him, the more insistent he became that things he believed in were true. And by this point, I had began to tell him several times that I wasn't comfortable hearing about these things, and to please stop talking about them around me. The next school year started off awful and got even worse for me mentally, emotionally, and academically. In December of 2017, I finally couldn't take it anymore, and I told Dee that since he couldn't respect my wishes and not talk about the things that he did, knowing how they affected me due to what I've been through before I met him, that I didn't wish to have contact with him anymore. If he was willing to honor my wishes, we could still be friends. He flipped out. This was when I finally woke up from my depressive slumber enough to realize that Dee was no longer the friend that I had met almost a year and a half ago. After I told him I didn't want to see him anymore, he started calling and texting me at all hours of the day and night, leaving long voicemails and endless text messages, trying to prove to me that he was who he said he was, a prophet and God's chosen one. He would make prophecies over my life saying that certain things would come true, and that frankly scared the hell out of me because they were so situation specific. I blocked his number in my phone, to which he responded by blowing up my Facebook. I then deleted him off of Facebook and blocked his profile after ignoring his messages. He continued to blow up my inbox even after I did. Once I deleted and blocked him, I would start getting messages from random other profiles, claiming to be people he knew, relaying messages, but I just knew it was him. I would even start to see him at different places around town, even when I wouldn't tell people where I was going, which admittedly chalked up to coincidence since he lived so close to me. I had thought about going to the police, but figured they wouldn't do anything since he hadn't actively threatened me. I thought if I ignored him long enough, he would get the hint and leave me alone. But it wasn't until February of 2018 that I started to even realize how serious it all was. I had moved out of my parents' house in July of 2017 to be closer to school and work, and before all this happened, had invited Dee over several times to hang out, since he lived in with literal walking distance of my new street. He had even accompanied me on several nighttime walks in my new neighborhood to protect me from the local creeps that he knew roamed the bar district that was just up the road from us. That night in February, I fell injuring my foot badly enough that I would need to be taken to the doctor the next morning. I woke up the next morning to get ready for my appointment and checked my messages, only to find that he had created another new Facebook profile during the night and messaged me. But what he had written almost made my heart stop and a cold sweat broke out all over my body. "I was at your house last night to see if I could talk to you, but your car wasn't in the driveway. I waited for you for a while, but you never showed up." That was when I knew that this was very serious, and I decided that for the time being, I was going to be hiding out at home. At this point, I still didn't have any reason to think that going to the police was necessary, so I didn't report anything. I stayed with my parents, went to school and work, and all of a sudden it seemed like Dee was sort of an enigma that had disappeared. There were no new profiles popping up, no new messages. It was like he had just suddenly vanished, and I began to feel better than I had in a long time. But the situation was far from over. The climax of all of this happened one balmy night in mid-March of 2018. I had been commuting back and forth to school from home for a while now, 30 minutes each way. And this particular night, I had been on campus until around 10 p.m. or so working on a project. I was exhausted, and when I left campus that evening, I made a sudden split-second decision to stay at my house in the city, and I figured it was safe since there'd been no kind of activity from Dee. The decision to stay there was so last minute that I didn't have the chance to tell anyone, and no one should have known that I was going to be there that night. At this point, I had one roommate that I didn't know very well, as she had been gone on an out-of-state co-op for her engineering degree back in the fall, and given the situation at hand, I hadn't spent enough time in that house to really get to know her that well. I left campus and started to drive toward my neighborhood, thinking about how I just wanted to get to bed. But as I approached the first major intersection before my block, a sudden feeling of alertness came over me, and it was like my senses were heightened. The green glow of traffic lights seemed brighter, and everything seemed like someone had turned the sharpness of the image up to 1000. The closer I got to my neighborhood, something told me to turn around and go to my parents' house, but being the idiot that I am, I ignored it. As I came down the street, I looked around cautiously, and I didn't see any sign of anyone who might be watching me, and I felt a sigh of relief. The feeling was gone once I hit my block, and I attributed it to anxiety over being at my house again, given the situation with Dee. I parked the car and unlocked the front door to the surprise of my roommate, who wasn't expecting me to be home, and had been wondering where I had been. I didn't lock the front door because I needed to go out to my car and bring my school things in over the course of a couple of trips. Something I regret to this day, and my roommate and I started having a casual chit-chat as I stood in the foyer of our little house. I was inside for maybe 5 minutes at most when both of us were suddenly startled by the sound of someone pounding on our outside door, so loud it shook the frame. And when I turned around and saw who it was, I screamed bloody murder. Standing on our porch, dressed in all black clothes, and with a crazed look in his eyes, was Dee. His eyes were laser focused on me, and in an instant, he grabbed the handle of our glass storm door and ripped it open, as if he was going to walk right in the house. My roommate grabbed me and threw me into her bedroom, holding the door closed and telling them that he needed to leave. Now that I look back on it, him seeing her inside the house startled him, and he jumped back from the door and tried to hide himself beyond our line of vision on the porch. Something I was able to catch a glimpse of before I was shoved in the bedroom. Dee said he was sorry for busting in on us, but that he just wanted to make sure I was okay. At the threat of having the police be called on him by my roommate and Dee begging us to not turn him in, he told me he would leave me alone and left. But as he went off our porch and into the darkness, he turned around and, over his shoulder, warned, "Be sure to keep your door locked." Dee disappeared off into the night, and once the initial shock of what had just happened passed, I bawled my eyes out. My roommate wanted to call the police then and there, but I was so emotionally drained that I just wanted to go to bed, promising my roommate that I would go down to the police station and take care of it in the morning. Needless to say, everything that happened after is all kind of blurred together. I went to the station to file a report, and I was sent upstairs to talk to a crisis advocate for victims of violent crime and given papers for a restraining order. I contacted the leaders of the college and aged ministry at the church, letting them know what happened and why I hadn't been coming to midweek services. I had stopped going in the fall because of depression and to avoid Dee after I had cut off our friendship. I found out from several people during this time that Dee had still been coming every week, looking for me and had been saying things about him being an angelic being that were causing concern among the leaders. I had also not been attending school daily that semester because the depression really started to get to me. But after this happened, I became a complete shut-in at my parents' house, living only to go to work and one class that I absolutely could not get away with missing. I had been diagnosed with PTSD back in the fall as well, and I had started counseling during this time as well. But the progress I had made evaporated when all of this happened. I continued to find out more and more things about D that made me realize just how dangerous having him around was. Too, as it turns out, D was known as the neighborhood crazy, and in addition to being on the autism spectrum, also suffered from paranoid delusional schizophrenia and frequently went off of his medication, and consequently had a very long history of run-ins with the police for causing a public disturbance and even violating other protection orders taken out against him by other people he'd stalked. When he was off of his medication, he was known to break into houses and had even been kicked out of college for going off of his meds and having a psychotic episode that was so bad that someone accused him of hurting them. He ultimately wasn't arrested or had any charges pressed against him because the person who made the accusation against him had a history of making false accusations against people. But the university determined him to be too much of a liability and permanently banned him from setting foot on the campus, as well as the school's regional branches. After this incident, and something else that happened later, sensitive info, so I won't divulge, he was finally court-ordered into mandatory counseling as well, as a 2-year-long probationary period where he was forced to take his medication by injection or face jail time. He was halfway through his probation when I met him, remembering that he had lost a friend around the time he started having his visions, which I'm sure now are psychotic hallucinations, triggered by the trauma of the event or something similar. I tried to find an obituary or any mention of his friend anywhere, and there was nothing to indicate that this person even existed. I continued to stay in that house until this past October when I moved across town, but it was midsummer 2018 before I could comfortably stay the night there again. I never did get to finish my degree, and I was a year away from graduation when I dropped out, but I've decided that if I ever do come back and finish, the best thing is going to be for me to get out of the area completely. I don't hate D for what happened, and I know that he is a very sick individual that has tons of demons of his own that he will be dealing with for the rest of his life. But even knowing that, I still don't wish to meet him ever again. This is a story of my best friend and what her life is like with the Stalker. This will be the abridged version, but still will be long. She knew of him through a mutual friend, and he lived in Delaware. We lived in Tennessee. He came to visit his friend, met her once, then decided to move here. After he had lived here for 6 months, they began dating. 3 months into them dating, he admitted he moved here because he wanted to be closer to her, even though they weren't romantically involved at the time. Before they had ever dated, he asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said that she likes stars, so just something with stars on it. And he literally bought her a star in the sky and named it Terra. It was also accompanied with a very intense and creepy love letter. She didn't see it as a warning sign, and she liked the attention. I told her that it was overboard and creepy. The first week of them dating, he began going through her phone and purse at every opportunity. She was furious about this and told him her phone is private. She said he should only snoop if he has a good reason to do so, not just because he wants to keep tabs on who she texts. She puts a lock on her phone, but it doesn't take long for him to figure out the lock code. He didn't admit to going through her phone again, but she knew he was, because he would always seem to bring up a person that may have texted her that day, or the subject that was spoken of. Some phone numbers of her closest guy friends had been changed in her phone as well. He wouldn't let her go anywhere without him. He would make plans with her for every single day of the week, and then make her promise to follow through with the plans, even though they lived together. If she ever went back on the plans because something else came up that she wanted to do, he would throw a bit of a fit and say she's a liar because she didn't keep her promise. It was things like she had promised to eat dinner at home with him, small things. He would often react violently. She became increasingly agitated with this controlling and smothering behavior and told him that she wanted to go have girl time with me, that she needs some breathing space for a night. He made her promise to let him come if we hung out with other people. About an hour before she was coming to meet me, I got a phone call from a friend that had moved across the country. He was in town and wanted to see me. I told him that I would have a friend with me that night, but we'd swing by his house for about an hour if she was okay with it. I asked Tara if she's cool with it, and she says of course. A few minutes later, I got a text from him asking if he could come because of the promise that Tara had made to him. I said, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's acceptable. This is a friend that I haven't seen in several years, and I'm already taking one person over to his mom's house that he doesn't know. It would be rude to bring another. And we're only staying there for about an hour anyways. A few minutes after, Tara texts and says she's walking out her door. She never makes it to my house. I called and texted but couldn't get to her. I finally got one text from her that just said, "Help." I immediately drove to her apartment where I found her on her balcony. He had stolen her phone and locked her on her balcony so she couldn't leave. They broke up for a while, and I guess out of being lonely she got back with him. One night, he bursted through my front door unannounced because he hadn't talked to Tara in 30 minutes. She went to dinner with a family friend and he was following her and spying on her. Her phone had died and he panicked when he lost track of her. He freaked out in my living room, and I also found out that he had saved the numbers of all the guys she had in her phone. I told him he was not allowed to be near me again, even if Tara was with him. He seemed to act normal for a while until Tara became pregnant. He was ecstatic, and she was scared. After about a week, she started getting excited about being a parent. That was until she started adding some things up. Her birth control had mysteriously vanished not long before she got pregnant. He was giving her vitamins every day and watching her take them. He said she needed to take them because she's anemic. When she looked up the pills, they were for fertility. She also remembered a few times when he said he was wearing a condom, and she didn't think it felt like one was there. He had been trying to get her pregnant. She understandably chose to not keep the baby after finding this out, and she was terrified of him after this. He would have used that baby as a way to get to Tara. It would have meant nothing more to him. They split again. He still lived in their apartment after they split, and she would drop by here and there to get some of her stuff. He seemed to be handling things okay until Thanksgiving. He threw her all over the apartment when she stopped by for stuff. That night, he said he was going to spend the night out of town in Nashville, that he needed Tara to stay there and watch his puppy. She made sure it had food and water, but didn't want to be there in case he came back. He did. At 1 a.m., she gets dozens of phone calls from him. He was never in Nashville. He was just trying to get her alone and flipped his shit when she wasn't there. He sent her 115 texts that all said, "Respond to me." He began driving by her work and house all the time. He would call and text her incessantly. He told her that he isn't promising his sanity or her safety, and that he would kill her. He started taking her mail even. I told her that I would go get her mail for her, but he said he wouldn't give it to me. He'd only give it to her if she came in person. He began threatening me and saying that it was my fault. Yes, I had encouraged her to get away from him. He was insane and everyone was scared for her. She was living at my house because he didn't know where I lived at the time. I finally decided to treat him like a kid, and I called his mother in Delaware. I told her of his behavior and threats and asked if she could help him. He ended up moving back to Delaware, but would still call and text Tara all the time. He also made sure to bash her to every person she knew. He would come back to town often, and he would go everywhere he knew she would go. He would go places where her friends worked. He would drive by her work. He would send her gifts, and sometimes she'd see him waiting outside of places she was at. It finally stopped, though. She had a year of silence from him, and she had even moved to a different state with the guy she was dating. Her and her new boyfriend split, and she moved back home to Tennessee and started working at a hotel. He once came into her hotel and bought a room for the night. The next morning, he checked out and drove back to Delaware. He drove 12 hours to stay at her hotel for one night, and then turned around and went back. He sent her a text a few months ago saying he's moving back here. For several years, she was constantly on edge. She gets nervous if she sees a car like his, and she has a genuine fear that he will hurt her if he gets the opportunity. She thinks he'll kill her one day, and I'm also afraid of that as well. She has numerous police reports over this guy, and I hate seeing how he's damaged her, and she's afraid to get close to another guy. She doesn't want kids now, and she's always nervous. We still use the buddy system. She doesn't go anywhere at all by herself. It only takes one moment of her being alone for him to get her. So I own this property in the countryside of Alabama. It's in the middle of nowhere with 60 plus acres. It has an abandoned house, barn, and greenhouse. The barn and house are close to each other, and the greenhouse is far into the woods. Me and my friend were setting up our film equipment in the house because we were going to film a video the next day. My friend wakes up and tells me he's getting really weird feelings about all of this, so we go to sleep in my truck. I fall asleep when we get in the truck, and my friend is still awake. He told me it was around 4 in the morning and he saw 7 to 8 people in hoods and robes. He said they looked around the house for a bit, probably to see if anyone was there because they saw our equipment in my truck. One of the guys stared directly at my friend in the car, but my windows are tinted, so the guy had a hard time seeing my friend. The guy stops investigating my truck and goes back with the group. My friend tried to wake me up, but I wouldn't. The morning came and my friend was still very sleepy from not catching sleep. And we went into the house to check on everything. The lights are smashed, papers are burned, umbrellas are broken. We found candles around the house and a cat nailed to a wall with a pentagram around it. We found decayed animals, 2 dogs, some horses, some cattle, birds, a bat, and some kind of hand buried. Since this place was once farmland, I just assumed the previous owners just left the animals to die or something, but I didn't know how to explain the bat, birds, and hand. This stuff was found near the barn and in the barn. So one day we come back to see if there's any more weird shit going on, and we find 3 pigs on crosses near the house. The pigs were decapitated and the heads were on the ground in front of them. They were wearing makeup and they had wigs sewn into their heads. My friend tells me he thinks the people he saw the last time we were there did it, and he was telling me he thought they might be a satanic cult or some weird group. Around the crosses and pigs, some parts of the ground was burned, a few large circles. We spent the rest of our day taking down the pigs and burying them in the woods. We go here again to ride some dirt bikes and ATVs, and nothing weird was there when we came. We put them in the barn because we would come back later in the week. My friend's putting up his ATV and tells me he saw a person in the barn, just relaxing on some hay. But it was in the dark, in one of those horses or cattle stalls. My friend stood there for a while to see if it was a person, and the man moved his hand in a goodbye kind of way. My friend runs out of the barn and tells me what happens. I go in there because I thought my friend was just bullshitting me, but no one was in there. Then when I'm leaving the barn, I see the guy trying to sleep on the 2nd story, and I ask if he's alright, and he tells me he is, and to just go away and let him sleep. Even though it's my property, I didn't want to start any shit with him, so I let him be. We end up thinking that he is part of the group that's been doing stuff on my property. We go there again about 2 weeks later, and we see from my truck the guy walking out of the barn and talking to 2 guys. One of them point to my truck and they all run into the woods. I get my knife and gun. I keep it under my seat, and finally it came in use. We then go to the guys to tell them that they can't come here anymore and that it's my property. I can't find them, but we found that most of them stay inside the greenhouse. We found clothes, books, and dead birds and squirrels, and I'm assuming that's what they ate. There was a pond nearby, so that's probably what they bathed in, or maybe they didn't bathe at all. We go to the barn to investigate some more, and we found books on the 2nd story, an altar, and some tall candles. All of this was out of sight from the ground. We also found stuff like rope, knives, nails, a hammer, and a mallet. We conclude that all of those guys there are in the group, and they did all this weird shit. We have not been on that property for months now, so we don't know if they're still there or moved on. The police have searched there before for 2 guys that kidnapped a 9-year-old too, so those guys might be blamed for that. The police found no one though.